Thanks, and it's brilliant to be here. Thank you for coming. It's brilliant to be here because I was at one stage a complete regular at this seminar when I was a PhD student, particularly that was in the 90s, and when I taught at Kingston University, just following that period. Obviously living in Northumbria, in fact I live in North Northumberland, so it's even further than Newcastle, where the Northumbria University is based. But living in Northumberland, I don't come down so often, although the owl does suggest that it's possible, so I'll have to think about for the future. I've been working on this project, which I'm going to talk about for a couple of years now. It's been very generously funded by the Wolfson-funded, and we're in the Wolfson room now, so that is quite appropriate. So I should say thank you to the Wolfson Foundation for awarding the Wolfson Professorship, which is what this is part of. And those of you who many of you, of course, won't, but those of you who've been reading my work over years, well, I've worked quite a lot on Atlantic worlds, the slave trade and the abolition of the slave trade, and so on. And you might be wondering how I come to this topic, but there is a path that will be clear. First of all, I wrote a book on Quaker anti-slavery about 10 years ago, or it came out about 10 years ago, and I've also written a number of papers about Methodist and to a certain extent Anglican anti-slavery as well. So there's actually quite a strong religious history interest that has gone through my career. But also the book that I was working on before this project started, The Unnatural Trade, it's about the ways in which naturalists wrote about slavery when they encountered it in the Caribbean and North America. And then the way that in decades later, abolitionists took the accounts of naturalists and turned it sort of against them in a way. They were usually naturalists working on behalf of the planters, and they used the evidence of naturalists to develop an argument that slavery and the slave trade were unnatural. And so that work, that study there, has brought me very closely into the sort of world of the history of natural history, alongside my existing interest in religious history. So it became quite obvious to me while I was writing a chapter of that book, The Unnatural Trade, on one of the clerical naturalists that have come up this evening, that here was a large group of people who hadn't yet been studied. Now, I should just say, I'm talking a little bit about my previous project. It's kind of a plug, because that book has just come out finally. It was years of it. It got delayed by COVID, as so many projects did. It's actually already out in the United States. It'll be out in the UK officially in a couple of weeks' time. But I have got 4 advanced copies there, which are available to be bought if you're interested. If you want a copy, normally 49 quid, but I've got it for 35, so it's a bargain. But if you're interested in having a look, if someone wants to pass one copy around, please do. And there's some flyers there. If you want to just grab one and pass it around, that would be just have a look. And if you if you don't want to buy it, please ask the library to. But just return them to the table at the end, or give them 75 quid. Either way, I'm happy. But let me get on to what I'm talking about this evening: the rational study of God's word, and which is a quotation I'll come to in a moment. Let me just sort out this clicker thing. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is this question of the clerical naturalists. So I will answer, I hope, the question of who were the clerical naturalists. And I will probably answer that in far too much detail, but we'll get a good idea of who this group of people were. I think briefly about what they did, what sorts of things they got up to. And I will conclude by looking at some notable examples from the 17th, but mostly the 18th century. And luckily, that's a part of the talk, which is like a concertina. Depending on how much time is left, I can give more or less biographical information about those individuals. So let's just start with who were the clerical naturalists. Well, they are clergymen, but also some women who studied nature. It's as simple as that. And I say some women because although unless you were a Quaker, there was very little chance for you holding any position of official office or responsibility within the church in our period. There are plenty of women who are fully involved both in natural history and in church work. And I'll look at some examples as we go along. but most of them are inevitably men. I've currently got 1,140 individuals in my database. I thought it was going to be a few hundred. No, it's well over 1,000. I keep on finding more all the time. The database is quite extensive, chronologically speaking. The earliest one in the database is St Cuthbert, who is from the 7th to the 8th century. St Cuthbert is the big saint in my part of the world, in Northumberland, associated with Holy Island and Lindisfarne. And he has said, this is when you always, start thinking, alarm bells start ringing when people said, it is said that he was involved in several miracles involving wildlife, otters and ducks, and that he brought in rules to protect the wildlife on the Northumberland coast. I say it is said, a monk wrote this up about 500 years after Cuthbert had died, so it's not really a first-hand account. But in the Middle Ages, that's 500 years later is about as good as they can manage half the time, and that's what gives him precedence or first place in my list of clerical naturalists. The last one is Richard Addington, who worked very closely with farmers during his ministry, and he died in 2002, so he's the most recent person in my database. And from our, well, not just from our period, these are a few examples, and I'm going to talk about many of these in more detail later on, but we've got people like John Ray there, William Borlase, Griffith Hughes. Griffith Hughes is in chapter 2 of the book that's circulating around. I'm sure that Gilbert White will be known to all of you, or at least you will have heard of him, even if none of the others are familiar to you. There's Gilbert White there of Selborne. John Lightfoot there, William Paley, Margaret Gatty, and Francis Orpen Morris. Now, Orpen Morris becomes an obsessive anti-Darwinian, and it's he's sort of towards the end of the study because, in fact, the study closes in 1860 because the whole relationship between science and religion changes profoundly after the publication of The Origin of Species. Francis Orpen Morris and also Margaret Gatty, the woman up there, is are kind of some of the anti-Darwinians. But that's a paper to give to a Victorian seminar, and I won't be talking much about them this evening. So they're often motivated, people that I'm looking at, by principles of natural theology, and speaking intellectually, that's kind of what unites them. Natural theology is that branch of theology which tries to determine, to prove the existence of God and determine the nature of God by thinking of God as creator, and then by studying the creation. The idea being that if you can work out what the character of God is by looking at what God has created. And that, in a nutshell, is natural theology. And natural theology often leads people into viewing natural history work as a kind of form of devotion, so that by doing natural history, by observing and cataloguing the creation, you are also not just trying to understand, but you're also worshipping the creator. And it is where in the 17th and 18th century, there's a very sort of strong, and into the 19th century, there's a very strong sort of confluence between science and religion. So much so that, in fact, almost every natural history written by a clerical naturalist, and many written by people who are not clerical naturalists, including Linnaeus, begin with invocations to natural theology. There's a quotation from the Book of Psalms on the frontispiece of Linnaeus' Systema Naturae, for example, and it's the one which says, "O Lord, how manifest are thy works," which is the sort of natural theology psalm. And this leads to these sort of statements that you get in these works, such as this. This is from a book called Flora Scotica by John Lightfoot. John Lightfoot was a mid to late 18th century naturalist. He was a friend of Thomas Pennant, and Thomas Pennant took him on his second tour of Scotland, when Pennant by this point was incredibly famous, and Lightfoot accompanied him as a sort of a sidekick. Poor Lightfoot had to sort of like sit around moping while Pennant went around and got given the freedom of every city in Scotland, everywhere they went. Lightfoot was a hanger on, but it transformed him. The 3 months of his life in 3 months he spent in Scotland, and he spent the next 10 years writing a flora of Scotland, and he did that at a distance, essentially by writing to the clergy in Scotland and saying, you know, brother clergy, whatever, oh, their title might be brother minister or whatever, please could you tell me what plants are in your parish, and so on. And he writes in the preface to his Flora Scotica, should the following performance happen to excite any to the study of the vegetable creation, it may possibly become the source of much health and pleasure by the exercise it necessarily promotes to the body and the complacency it always begets in the mind. But should it prove the happy instrument of diverting any from foolish and unmanly pursuits to the rational study of God's works and the contemplation of his sublime attributes manifested therein, which is the natural tendency of such a study, my time and labour have not been employed in vain. And that's a kind of a really good pithy example of a kind of natural theology statement at the beginning of a work of natural history by clerical naturalists. And you will find similar statements in almost all the published works in those 1,100 people I've identified, or at least those that have been published. Many of them didn't. And I think this reminds us, one of the reasons why it's worth studying them, reminds us that the 18th century was not merely the age of reason, as we're so often given to thinking of it, but it was also an age of faith. The 18th century was a period in which most people were, at least on paper, worshippers, and most people believed in some kind of deity. There was, of course, all sorts of conversations about what shape that belief took. But also, it's not merely just the one sort of passive faith, because the 18th century is the era of the rise of evangelicalism in Britain, the Great Awakenings in America, and Methodism, of course. So there are quite powerful religious movements taking place at exactly the same time that there are the developments in science and philosophy that we come to think of as the age of reason or the Enlightenment. And I think that as historians, we have to remember that the world of faith, maybe it's not one that we subscribe to ourselves, maybe it's not a set of beliefs that we hold ourselves, but they are incredibly important for this period. And I think quite often this is underplayed, and people don't pay enough attention to the religious aspect of our period. And the clerical naturalists as a group are, I think, actually very rarely studied, and they're not well understood. That's despite the fact that almost everybody's heard of the Parson Naturalist. Everyone's heard that phrase. We all know of the existence of this kind of character, but there's actually been very, very few studies done. There have been a number of studies of individuals, particularly some celebrated individuals such as Gilbert White, inevitably, but a few others, John Ray, and is another very good example of someone who's been studied much more extensively. But in general, as a group, they're not very well understood. And there's really only one dedicated study. It's called the English Parson Naturalist by Patrick Armstrong. And it's the work of an amateur historian who is an enthusiast for this subject, which means that sometimes it's very lively and interesting to read, but it's not necessarily grounded in the sort of study that one would hope in places. And it's quite impressionistic. And it makes some big claims, which are quite testable. He says the 19th century was perhaps the heyday of the English Parson Naturalist. He says the tradition of the Parson Naturalist is a distinctively English one. God, he didn't use the word quintessentially. You always know when that word and that English go together, something, mindless is going to be said. But no, the tradition of the Parson Naturalist is a distinctively English one, and to some extent, a distinctively Anglican one. So I think these are testable statements, and I've had to look into that. So as part of my study, what I've done is I've compiled a database, which, as I say, has got 1,100 or more individuals, and I'm adding more regularly. So if you know anyone in that list, then please let me know, and you can get the list online. I'll put the link up in a moment or at the end. I've completed analysis in all of my fields of about 400 of the individuals, and I've done all of the people born before 1780. So as you don't get ordained until you're 24, that means that these are all people who are all the people I've done sort of proper analysis of are from the 18th century or before, and I'm now making inroads into the 19th century. And I've done a partial analysis of another 200 in the 19th century, in the 20th century. When I say an analysis, I've got a whole number of fields. I mean, this is just the sort of beginning of the database, and it goes on right over Tim's head and out through the window there. We were to scroll through it, and there's all sorts of information, and so you can sort of see, including sort of potted biographies. The full list is on my website, brycchan.com, naturalists. I'll put that up again later. And I've the list has pulled out some data from the database that's actually readable and approachable. So this is a section, a screen grab from that part which lists people who were born in the late 17th century, 18th century. And you can see what I've done is I've got their dates, birth and death, a little biography, and then links to key data. Stephen Hales is a good example just to pick on here, because there are links there to BHL, which is the Biodiversity Heritage Library, as an author. Some of his texts reside there and can be read. CCED, the Church of Clergy of the Church of England database, Royal Society database there, Wikipedia, and then there's two other things there with Armstrong and Desmond, which are printed sources for botanists, and Armstrong, of course, is the book I just showed you. So it's this sort of thing. So it's a resource that you can go and use right now. These potted biographies won't tell you an awful lot, but you can then follow the links and the data and you know, and do your own research from there, and they'll give you a starting point. And as I say, I've done most of the people born up to the end of the 18th century, more or less. When you go down the list into the 19th century, it starts to look a little bit sketchier. So you can see here, really all I've got is a source or sometimes a couple of sources and names and dates. These will be filled up in due course, but they still are there listed just because it's a, you know, it's very easy. The list is there. I'm putting information up as I get it. And I think the data that I've got so far is helpful in a number of ways. Partly in, you know, allowing you to go off and follow up the research that I've started. Partly because it actually brings together for the first time this group of people into one place, so that we can actually see who they were. But also because the data set that I've been collecting allows us to do some sort of quantitative analysis of who people are. And I've attempted that. Now, what I'm going to show you is a sort of series of graphs that come out of that data, with the caveat that this is not the end of the project, and I'm still adding data, and these will probably shift a bit as we go along. And I've indicated when we get to it a few places where I think the dial will move, but I think it allows us to answer some of those questions that Armstrong poses us. So this is a graph in which I'm trying to work out when the clerical naturalists might be found. And this is a bit of a difficult one, because just plotting people's birthdays is of no use whatsoever, because people don't tend to do much work on their birthday. I mean, on the day of their birth. They probably don't do much work on their birthday either, but unless they're particularly obsessive. So I sort of took a random sample of about 30 individuals who publish, and worked out that what seems to be a period of peak activity is in their mid-40s, more or less, on average. So what I've done is I've done a graph here of people's birth dates plus 45 years, which kind of gives us, I hope, a sense of peak career or mid-career points, if you like. And this, because I've got birth and death dates for almost everyone in the database, this is an actual complete set all the way through from Cuthbert to Addington. And what this shows is that things sort of bumble along until the mid to late 18th century. There's a rise in mid-career dates from 1765 to 1825, and a steep rise up into about 1860, a sort of twin peaks, 1860, 1880, which corresponds with Armstrong's heyday of the English Parson Naturalist, and then a quite steep decline, particularly after 1900, which can be attributed either to or both to a change in religious belief and scientific belief after that period, but also with the increasing professionalisation of science, so that people are much more likely to be doing natural history from an organisation such as the Natural History Museum or a university, than they are likely to be doing it from a church. So that would seem to corroborate it. But actually, I don't think this is an accurate picture. So I've sort of replotted it in a couple of ways. First of all, the population is growing quite steeply in the same period. So I wanted to ask, well, actually, what's the influence of these people as a group, and where is their influence group relative to the size of the population as a whole? So I've kind of done a ratio there to population. That is to say, you know, if you walk down the street, how likely are you to bump into a clerical naturalist in this period at the peak of their career? And this actually changes the picture quite substantially, because as a ratio of population, you can see that there's a kind of a steep rise at the beginning of the 18th century after 1710, another even steeper rise after 1780, and that peak is now around 1800 to 1820. And as a proportion of population, the steep decline actually starts after about 1830 and becomes precipitous in the 1860s. So that if we're now thinking of you know, the numbers of clerical naturalists at their peak career as a percentage of the population, they're actually an 18th century story, not a 19th century story in terms of influence. So, you know, the 18th century was perhaps the heyday of the English parson naturalists. Well, perhaps in absolute terms, there were probably more around. But as a proportion of the population, no, they were actually a declining number relative to the number of people around. I should also say that the records we've got are much more complete for the 19th century. So that the beginnings of the kind of the rise of local and national natural history societies begins at the end of the 18th century with things like the Linnean Society, and then the county naturalist clubs, which sort of really start burgeoning between about 1800 and 1850. And a lot of the information that I've been able to glean or identify people in the first place comes from the membership lists of, what ultimately derives the membership lists of organisations that didn't exist before 1800. So we've got a much better data set there as well. And I suspect there were probably quite a lot of clerical naturalists operating in the 18th century who just have not left much of a record behind. So that's also, I think, skews it. And I also think that much of the work in the 17th and 18th century was groundbreaking. It was important. It made a difference. People read it. You know, whereas a lot of the 19th century work that I've been able to identify is actually quite incremental or very minor. I've got a lot of records of the Reverend such and such who botanised in Dorset in 1879. We've got one record of one specimen that they collected, which is now somewhere in a drawer in the University of where have they got universities in Dorset? Bournemouth. That would be one. It's just a made-up example, but the point is that I've got a lot of 19th century records of people who've got just one or two herbarium specimens, or just noted as being a member of a county naturalist club, and very little else to go on. Whereas in the 18th century, I think they're more substantial. Now, again, how do we measure that? How do we determine whether somebody is important or not? Well, I find that's a sort of a subjective judgment. It's very difficult to make that kind of judgment. So I decided to outsource that. And I've outsourced it to the editors of the Dictionary of National Biography. So I've had a look at the people in my database who have got DNB entries. And then that picture looks, again, rather flatter. The distinction between the 18th and the 18th and the 19th century here is actually not that enormous. That's a much flatter picture. And that is, again, birth plus 45 years, so sort of imputed mid-career points. So although the actual numbers are rising eightfold, the numbers that are mentioned in the DNB are only going up, only doubling really on average. So if that's a measure of significance, I think it's a reasonably good measure of significance. We've got more significance per se in the 18th than in the 19th century. And if we redo that graph as a measure of population, it becomes even flatter again as a ratio of population with a peak at around 1775. So all of this stuff is to a certain extent impressionistic, and I do understand that, but also I think it is giving us a kind of a steer that the sheer numbers in the 19th century probably are right, but the impact and the influence within society as a whole probably just as important in the 18th century as in the 19th century, not more so. So, in fact, I would say that the period in which the most influence that this group has is about 1750 to about 1820. As to nation, well, here's a pie chart of what I've got so far. Yes, England is about 2/3, and the others, the other nations of the British Isles make up another proportion. There's a 10% associated with the British Empire. I would have thought that was bigger. I suspect they're probably missing records that I haven't yet managed to get my hands on here, which I am thinking about. And other is mostly North America and Europe. But the point here is that these actually, with the England versus the rest of the British Isles, actually pretty much mirror, not exactly, but the population distribution of the British Isles in any case. So it's not actually saying anything very special about the English here. It's not that they're completely more likely per se to be involved in this kind of work than somebody from Scotland or Wales. So I think that they're distributed across the Anglophone world, and that's all I'm studying at the moment, broadly in line with national populations. And as the denomination, well, that's almost exactly the same picture. But you would expect the English to be mostly Anglican in this period, and the numbers kind of correlate there, except that Wales is included within the Church of England in the 18th century and before. I've got a very large amount here for Quakers. That big 12% for Quakers is probably an overstatement due to the fact that I wrote my last book about Quakers, or not the last one, the one before, about Quakers. So I knew very quickly where to go and get data about Quakers. So that's probably me. And I think as the data set, particularly in the 19th century, becomes more complete, Quakers will diminish down to probably, I'm guessing, more like 3 or 4%. But again, what we've got here is a distribution of denominations that I think mirrors society more broadly and does not say anything particularly special about Anglicans, other than that Anglicans are the most common denomination in the British Isles. I don't think that we can read too much into the denomination thing, especially when you start looking overseas, which I haven't done any formal study of, but there are plenty of Lutheran, Catholic, and so on, clergy who are doing natural history in Germany, in France. In France, there's lots of Jesuit natural historians. There are plenty of Lutherans, particularly in Scandinavia and northern Germany. So again, I don't think denomination is really a factor here. I think clerical naturalists are diverse, and although they predominate, Anglicans predominate in the Anglophone world, I don't think we can read too much into that. So I'm sorry, Patrick Armstrong, but I'm tossing out that claim as well. These are not related to Armstrong's claims, but might just be of interest anyway. So far, of the records I've looked at, we've got the universities, a slight preference for Cambridge over Oxford. And I think that recognises the curriculum in Cambridge, which was much more scientific, much more mathematical than Oxford. But it's only a slight preference. The Scottish universities are doing quite well as a proportion of population, and Trinity in Dublin as well. Although actually scientifically leaning people in Scotland, especially in Edinburgh, seem to be pushed much more in the direction of medicine than towards life sciences, whereas I don't think that's the case with Oxford and Cambridge so much. There's quite a large percentage of none, 19%, Again, that possibly reflects the number of Quakers in the study, and I think that might go down somewhat. But these are mostly nonconformists, but also the number of people who were ordained, as they said, literate. That is to say, they didn't have a university degree, but they could prove to the satisfaction of the bishop that they understood their business well enough to be ordained, and there's actually sort of marked in the ordination as just as literate, and that's what it says there. So there are some of those are Anglicans without degrees. And to the question of this word, the parson naturalist, how many of them are parsons? That is to say, parish priests. And the word parson sort of often particularly means or has the implication of a rural parish priest. How many of them fit that mold? Well, if you look at the career summit, yeah, okay. Again, Friend comes in second, which is Quakers, and I think that's going to drop down the list as we go along. But you can see that rectors and vicars, ministers or pastors do predominate. That is kind of fair enough in a way, but lots of other people. There's surprisingly large amounts of bishops, for example, and and also other roles. Chaplains, for example, and also we've got a number of people who never got higher than curate. Almost everybody on this list was a vicar or a rector. Had probably been a curate at some point. Almost everyone who's a bishop probably been a parish priest at some point. These are career peeps. But there's quite a number of people who never get higher than curate who are in here. Quite a lot of chaplains, some of whom I think had congenial existence working as a chaplain to an aristocratic figure and settled there and spent the rest of their career cataloguing their collections and so on. And then should we put this into a pie chart? We see about 60% their career summit is parish priests or ministers, but 40% of them are in other roles. So I think that's quite a large minority. So again, calling all the clerical naturalists parsons, I think is a kind of a misnomer. That marital status I put in there because there was something that came up at the conference in Manchester as at last week. I was here, were there, and they were mostly married as far as we could tell. Yeah, so the English Parson Naturalist turns out not to be a parson, as much as one might think, which is why I'm using the term clerical naturalist rather than parson naturalist, as it's sort of a much wider brief. So I think I'll leave the sort of statistical analysis there. There's all sorts of things we could talk about that. I know that my methodology would probably, in some places, might raise questions and so on, and some of which I hope I've answered, and the others I haven't thought about. And again, that caveat that at the moment this is an incomplete data set, and I'm working my way through it. But still, I think it does give us an interesting statistical insight into who this group of people were. So just think about what clerical naturalists did. What were they doing? What were their activities? And we can kind of divide that up into half a dozen or so activities, which I've kind of listed here. Now, the caveat here is, of course, that I've got over 1,000 individuals. They're all doing very, very different things over different periods of time, from the Middle Ages into the 21st century. But what sort of things are they getting up to? Well, there's an awful lot of field work going on. That's one of the things to start with. Field work often in their own local parish. So there are lots of parish priests who are using their parish as their laboratory, as it were, who are then sort of seeing what's going on in their back garden, what's going on in the fields and the farms that they're ministering to, and that's quite important. And I think that a lot of the kind of what we might think of as local nature of especially rural British conservationism the character actually comes out of parish organisation, and the fact that people are thinking about parishes as places that that can be investigated, but also that can be conserved. And we notice that particularly that impulse in the mid to late 19th century and forwards. But nevertheless, in the 18th century, there's a lot of local botanising, a lot of local bird watching, and this is very much allied to the rise of accounts of counties, topographies, and there are lots of county natural histories that start from the beginning of the 18th century onwards. And I think they spend a lot of time reading and cataloguing. There's a lot of gleeful card indexing going on here, writing of notes and so on. And some of the naturalists actually get professional jobs doing that. So Lightfoot, who I mentioned earlier, became just the catalogues, the Duchess of Portland's private collection, and then rather sadly, when she died and it was sold off, he had to write the catalogue for the auction, which I think was a sadness for him. But there's a lot of reading going on as well, because perhaps like all naturalists in this period, but there's a lot of intertextuality, a lot of referring to each other's works, a lot of kind of quoting from and discussing each other's works as well. And a lot of writing is happening. So parish priests, well, all priests really are expected to write sermons and so on, but a lot of them are using the same kind of rhetorical skills that they perhaps learned at university to write sermons, to write natural history work as well. And we saw that extract from Lightfoot, how the kind of the natural history sort of segues into a little sermonizing there, but that's actually quite common. But also those rhetorical skills are quite powerful. Somebody who's used to writing for the pulpit is also well able to persuade in scientific discourse as well. And it's quite surprising just the number of people I've been able to identify who are authors of books. Many of those books long since, forgotten, but there's thousands of books out there, and even more articles. So from the mid-17th century onwards, sending an account of interesting phenomena in your parish becomes a sort of mainstay of things like philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, and then into the 18th century of publications like the Gentleman's Magazine. And if you go through the Gentleman's Magazine, and again, I haven't done a full analysis, there are so many other projects that can be done here. I haven't done a full analysis of this, but there is, just open up the Gentleman's Magazine almost randomly to anywhere in the mid-late 18th century, and you'll find a local parish priest writing in about a curious phenomenon that has been observed in their parish. I think it's also fair to say that they're not just interested in wildlife. There's a lot of other stuff going on. So the kind of people who become naturalists in this period tend also to be very interested in agriculture. And if you're interested in agriculture, that means you're also very interested in the condition of agricultural labourers. So they're often very connected with charitable schemes in agriculture. And a lot of them are also pursuing other intellectual interests as well. So there's quite a lot of sort of interest in local history. That is to say, history, not natural history. And a lot of the books of natural history that come out from clerical naturalists are also histories of local areas. And of course, the classic example is the Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne by Gilbert White, which you've all read, probably, at least you probably read the natural history part of it, but how many of you have read the antiquities part of it, which is very rarely published now? Yeah, well, okay, Steph, you have, and I have, but I bet the rest of we're the only ones. But the rest of but Gilbert White isn't even the first by a long chalk here. There are lots of the natural history, the antiquities of X books, dating even from the 17th century onwards. And a lot of clerical naturalists are also very interested in sort of what we might think of as literary or philological matters, and a lot of them are biblical scholars as well. So there's a lot of kind of interest in exegesis or biblical interpretation and so on. And finally, what do they get up to? Well, some of them, it appears, also found time to do church business. There is quite a tradition in the 18th century of taking the money from a living, paying a curate, and going off and suiting yourself. And there are plenty of these clerical naturalists who are doing that. But actually, all the evidence I've got suggests to me that the vast majority of clerical naturalists are actually quite assiduous churchmen. They are the sort of people who I'm one of those people who's on about 8 committees in my town, and there's some people like me who are on lots of committees, and most people are either on no committees or 8 committees or more, and that's the way it kind of works, I think. And clerical naturalists seem to have many multiple interests and to have been involved in lots of church organisations. Lots of them rise up through the church, which is why we've got bishops and deans and so on, canons, plenty of them. But actually, it's surprising to see that so many of them were actually good churchmen. They're doing their clerical business in their parish and contributing widely to their community and often more broadly to the diocese or to the nation as a whole in clerical terms. Well, I've got about 10 minutes left. So what I'm going to do now is just briefly introduce a few clerical naturalists in this period, some of whom you will have heard of, some of whom will be completely new to you. And I'm not going to go in a huge amount of detail, although please do feel free to ask about any individuals afterwards. But what I'm going to try and do is just give you a flavour of a dozen or so individuals from this period. Not in any way to hope to cover that huge database, but just to give a sense of what some of these people are and what they're doing. So I'm going to start with John Ray. Now, what you've got here is, this is just pasting in the mini biography that I've produced for the list on my website, so you can go and get this. So that's all I'm putting down here. Of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg, and I've also there are ways around it, but I've accepted the discipline of the Excel 255 character cut-off point in a cell for these biographies, which I think is actually a good discipline, because once you start writing more than that, you're not really doing a Potter biography. So this is why some of these things are rather short. But I'll start with John Ray. He's by no means the first really important clerical naturalist. I would argue that was probably William Turner in the 16th century, about whom I can talk in early modern context. But John Ray, I think, is very important, partly because of his importance to science, and partly because of his importance to natural theology. He was a preacher and a lecturer at Cambridge, but now this is where we get into the whole kind of business of oath taking in the 1670s, and I get a bit confused by some of this stuff. But he wasn't able to, or didn't feel able to take somebody can probably tell me this after I've forgotten about it, but so he wasn't able to be ordained to, he's ordained, he wasn't able to go to a living, so he preached as a lay preacher, even though he was ordained, and he eventually retired to a village outside of Cambridge and so on. But he wrote an enormous amount of scientific and theological work. So his scientific work includes the Methodus Plantarum Nova, the new method of plants. And the reason this is so important is because he took up, on a suggestion actually another cleric had made to him, of rather than arranging all the plants in his list alphabetically, as was the custom in the day, why didn't he organise them according to their similarities in form? And this was a bit of a breakthrough, the idea that you would group together plants according to, well, in his case, first of all, size, and then it gets more and more complex, trees, shrubs, bushes, herbs, and so on. But he would then look for characteristics such as shape of the leaves, type of fruit, and so on. And this is a new method indeed, because this is really the beginnings of systematic biology in the sense that this is when people are really starting to sort of think about how plants are related to each other. There were some earlier suggestions along these lines, particularly in Germany, from so on. But this is work that he's doing in Britain, and it's incredibly influential in Britain. Ray's method continues to be used well into the 18th century. It was, of course, supplanted by the Linnaean method in the mid-18th century. Much earlier in Europe, the Linnaean method was adopted much earlier in Europe. But Ray's method was a really powerful tool for naturalists at the end of the 17th and into the early 18th century. But also he's very, very important because he writes in English at this time, his other works in Latin, a book called The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of the Creation, which became the standard work of natural theology, or physico-theology as it would have been called at the time, throughout most of the 18th century. And it is picked up on time and time again by other clerical naturalists, and indeed others, naturalists who are not clerics, but it is picked up time and time again as the kind of theological statement of this group, if you like. And it is referred to well into the late 18th century. I think Gilbert White refers to it about half a dozen times, for example. Ray, very, very important in the in the late 17th century. Derham is his disciple. Derham is an absolute fan of Ray. He edits Ray's letters. He picks up Ray's method, and Derham then writes his own book, Physico-Theology, or a demonstration of the being and attributes of God from his works of creation, which is never quite as influential a work of natural theology as Ray's Wisdom of God, but it's still quite important. Derham's contribution to science is quite varied. He writes a number of papers to the Philosophical Transactions on varied things, lots of weather records from Upminster, some of the earliest weather records in the country. He writes an account of the death watch beetle that they got in the church at one point, which was obviously a serious concern that he had. But he's most famous for having being the first person to accurately determine the speed of sound, which he did by going up to the top of his church tower. And I've been up there. There's a little porthole where you can see through to the other church towers around in Essex and over the river into Kent. And he persuaded all the vicars of all the surrounding churches to haul up various guns and cannons and to set them off. And by observing the difference between when he observed the flash and he heard the report, and by triangulating to all these different churches, he was able to work out through the sound very accurately. And it's quite the paper he writes about in the Philosophical Transactions is very thorough. He insists that all of the other churches, they took up a whole variety of weapons, such as ranging from pistols to muskets to small cannon, to see if that made any difference to the speed of the sound. And I'm just trying to imagine how a parish priest would today run past the bishop and say, "I would just like to take up an array of weaponry to the top of the church tower, please." And anyway, he got away with it, and he became famous. For that. He also, in physico-theology, tries to talk about the speed of light, which he surmises is so much faster than the speed of sound, because it also brings the heat from the sun, and if it went at the same speed as sound, it would have cooled down that light by the time it got to Earth, and so Providence has wisely made light and heat travel faster than sound, and that's a kind of physico-theological argument, which of course doesn't stand up to reason, but can make perfect sense at the time. I'm just going to rattle through some of these. Cotton Mather is in my list. Now, of course, he's North American, but I'm including the North American colonies up until the 1770s and independence. I'm also including other parts of the British Empire up until their point of independence as well. Cotton Mather is a Congregationalist or Puritan, if you like, and he's celebrated for lots of very important scientific investigations, including inoculation. He's one of the first pioneers of inoculation in North America, and scientific works, including the Christian philosopher meaning scientist, of course, and he's also a keen bird watcher. He's probably remembered today mostly for his rather minor intervention in the Salem witch trials. In fact, that's the only context in which you ever hear his name mentioned, but he's actually a very important North American. Yes, it's flipped through. Here's another example. William Borlase, who important to me because I was brought up in the west of Cornwall, and William Borlase was the rector of two parishes in West Cornwall around Penzance and St Just. He wrote Natural History of Cornwall and Antiquities of Cornwall in the mid-18th century. The Natural History of Cornwall is notable because about a quarter of the book is a grammar of the Cornish language, which was just sort of dying out at that period. Very few people were left to speak it by the 1750s. So Borlase was one of the two or three people who were trying to collect that. Another person who rushed down to Cornwall to meet with who he'd heard was the last living speaker of Cornish, the collector of curiosities called Daines Barrington, who was one of the correspondents of Gilbert White, of course. Borlase is interesting in lots of ways in Cornwall. Because he's in a mining parish, he writes an awful lot about geology and mineralogy, and that's a very important part of his work. He's and meteorology as well. But also one of the things he does, which is not usual in this period, is he mentions the contributions that his wife Anne made to his studies all the way through his natural histories. And I think, therefore, he's an important example of how we can start to look for the involvement of women in clerical natural history. For that reason, I've included Anne Borlase in my database. All right, I'll just rattle through these a bit more quickly. I've got the Bartrams here, who are Quaker botanists, 2 generations from Pennsylvania. One of the earliest botanic gardens in America. You can still visit it in Philadelphia, or just outside Philadelphia. And another colonial is Griffith Hughes. Griffith Hughes is the Welsh preacher. He's actually the last Welsh-speaking minister or Anglican minister in North America. He was the rector of Radnor. He disappeared by some accounts with the church funds and then wrote to them we've still got the letters, a year and a half later, to say that he'd gone to Barbados because he had a bad knee. Then there's a lot of acrimony around this, but he then sort of reinvents himself as the minister to the planters in St Lucy's. He wrote the Natural History of Barbados. The Natural History of Barbados was commissioned by the Royal Society on the basis of one article he'd written about sea anemones in Barbados, and he was clearly not equipped to do the job, and it was absolutely trashed when it was reviewed when it came out in 1750, and he himself disappeared shortly thereafter, with or without the church funds, I don't know, but he took the church records in Barbados with him, and they're still missing. And also he's the subject of most of chapter 2 of the book, The Unnatural Trade, there, if you want to read more about Griffith Hughes. John Wallace, I just put this is talking to my home audience here, because he's the author of the Natural History and Antiquities of Northumberland, and there you see that formula, the Natural History and Antiquities, a very common formula, and this is a fabulous book if you're I live in Northumberland now, so a very important book in Northumberland history. I've said quite a lot about Gilbert White, so I won't say anything more about him. And John Lightfoot, there's a feedback. John Lightfoot, somebody's.
Yeah, so it's me, Mike slipped out.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. John Lightfoot, I mentioned earlier, he's the person who gave the title to this talk. He was, as I said, the personal chaplain to the Duchess of Portland, whose collection he curated. And as I said earlier, he's the one who went off to Scotland for 3 months, and then spent the rest of his life writing up that trip. William Paley, and I've almost finished now. William Paley, Archdeacon of Carlisle, his book, Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, was the natural theology textbook for the 19th century, in the same way that Ray's had been the natural theology textbook for the 18th century. And it's Paley who very famously created that watchmaker analogy, that if you found a watch on the road and you looked at it and you'd say, well, that looks like it's been designed, therefore that implies the existence of a designer. And it's that analogy which has been kind of roundly excoriated by modern evolutionary scientist Richard Dawkins, most famously so. He wrote a book called the the blind watchmaker. I have to say that whether you find either the science or the theology or both dubious, that as a literary device, as a metaphor, it's actually a very beautiful piece of writing. It's a very effective piece of rhetoric, and it has been effective in promoting its case for many years since, and continues to be in certain Christian communities in various parts of the world today. So I'm going to finish there, and with and just sort of bring together a couple of conclusions. So again, you can take the website if you want to go and look and explore through that list some more. You can do so. So, I mean, my three conclusions, really, in a nutshell, are first of all that clerical naturalists in the British Isles and the British Empire were diverse. They weren't just English, they weren't just Anglican, they were doing lots of stuff. They were involved in many, many things. Second, although they were at their greatest numbers in the 19th century, I think they probably had more influence in the mid-18th to early 19th century. So a bit earlier, that's where they're the most influential and important. And I also think that they shouldn't be ignored. I think we have to take this group of people seriously and recognise that they were important to the development of the life sciences, but also, and perhaps more especially, to the cultures of natural history, and as I suggest, into the ways that people think about their local patch, their parish, and the wildlife that can be found in it to this day. And I'm going to end by just putting up a slide, which is a naked plug for a conference which Steph over here and I are running at Selborne on Gilbert White in this context. I'll just leave that up there and you can read it, but that's me done, and I hope I didn't go too far over time, but I'm sure I did a bit, but I hope you've found that interesting.
Thank you very much.